Brussels, 1979, a quiet residential street in the diplomatic quarter. Inside an elegant townhouse, a man who calls himself David Arbal sits at his desk reviewing shipping manifests. His business card identifies him as an independent maritime consultant specializing in Mediterranean trade routes. His office is modest but professional, charts on the walls, shipping schedules on the desk, telephone that rings occasionally with legitimate business inquiries. Neighbors know him as a polite, reserved professional who travels frequently for work. His landlord has no complaints. His business associates find him knowledgeable and reliable. Everything about David Arbal's life is perfectly ordinary, perfectly documented, perfectly believable. And every single detail is a lie. David Arbal doesn't exist. The maritime consulting business is a front. The office is a stage set. The phone calls are scripted. The entire operation is an elaborate trap designed by Mossad to lure Iraqi intelligence operatives into revealing themselves. For 18 months, Israeli intelligence has maintained this fiction, waiting patiently for Iraqi agents to take the bait. They've created not just a fake identity, but an entire fake life complete with bank accounts, business relationships, social connections, and a personal history that can withstand investigation. And in 3 weeks, when an Iraqi intelligence officer finally makes contact seeking information about Israeli weapons shipments, the trap will spring shut. This is the story of Operation Wooden Leg, when Mossad created a perfect illusion and used it to map an entire enemy intelligence network by doing nothing more than waiting for the enemy to make the first move. The story begins in 1978, in the aftermath of Egypt's Camp David Accords with Israel. The peace treaty between Egypt and Israel fundamentally altered Middle Eastern geopolitics, removing the largest Arab military from the coalition against Israel. For Iraq, this was both threat and opportunity. Saddam Hussein, who had consolidated power as Iraq's de facto leader, saw himself as the new champion of Arab resistance to Israel. Iraq had oil wealth, a large military, and ambitions to develop nuclear weapons. But Iraq lacked something Egypt had possessed: direct intelligence about Israeli military capabilities, weapon systems, and strategic planning. Iraqi intelligence services had limited presence in Europe and almost no penetration of Israeli networks. They were operating blind, trying to assess a threat they didn't fully understand. Mossad understood this vulnerability. Iraqi desperation for intelligence about Israel created an opportunity for deception. If Mossad could create a convincing source of information, someone who appeared to have access to Israeli secrets, Iraqi intelligence would likely attempt to recruit or cultivate that source. Once contact was made, Mossad could control the information flow, feeding disinformation while simultaneously identifying Iraqi intelligence officers, mapping their networks, and understanding their collection priorities. It was classic counterintelligence work, but on a scale and with a sophistication that required extraordinary patience and resources. The concept was called a dangle operation, deliberately placing a potentially valuable asset in a position where enemy intelligence would discover and attempt to recruit them. The challenge was making the dangle convincing enough that sophisticated intelligence services wouldn't suspect deception. That required creating not just a fake person, but a fake life so detailed and consistent that it would withstand the background checks and surveillance that any professional intelligence service would conduct before making contact. The person had to have legitimate reasons to possess the information Iraqi intelligence wanted, plausible motivation to share it, and enough credibility that Iraqi handlers would trust the intelligence provided. Mossad's research department, responsible for long-term strategic operations, designed the cover identity over 6 months in 1978. They created David Arbal, a Jewish Israeli who had immigrated to Belgium in the early 1970s after serving in the Israeli Navy. His backstory was meticulously constructed. Born in Haifa in 1944, served as a naval logistics officer during the Six-Day War, left military service in 1971, moved to Europe seeking business opportunities, established a maritime consulting firm in Brussels. The backstory included verifiable details, military service records that could be confirmed through contacts in Israel's defense establishment, university records showing degree in maritime studies, business registration documents in Belgium, But the genius of the operation was in the psychological profile they created. David Arbal wasn't portrayed as a traitor or ideologue. He was a businessman who had become disillusioned with Israel's political direction after the Lebanon conflicts, someone who maintained professional contacts in Israel's defense industry, and someone who critically seemed to need money. Financial desperation is one of the most common motivations for espionage. A person selling secrets for ideological reasons raises suspicions about reliability. A person selling secrets because they're drowning in debt is understandable, predictable, controllable. Iraqi intelligence would be looking for precisely this profile. The actual Mossad officer chosen to play David Arbal, his real name has never been revealed, was in his mid-30s. Native Hebrew speaker but fluent in French and English, with genuine naval background that allowed him to discuss maritime logistics convincingly. He spent 3 months in deep preparation, memorizing every detail of his cover identity, studying maritime trade to the point where he could discuss it with actual professionals, and developing the personality traits of David Arbal: slightly cynical, financially stressed, morally flexible enough to consider selling information but cautious enough not to be reckless. It was method acting applied to espionage, creating a character so completely that the line between performance and reality blurred. In January 1979, David Arbal moved into a townhouse in Brussels' diplomatic quarter. The location was deliberate, close enough to embassies and international organizations that an intelligence operative living there wouldn't be unusual, but not so close that it appeared suspicious. The townhouse was rented through legitimate channels, with David Arbal providing real financial documents showing income from his consulting business. The business itself was real, at least on paper. It had been registered legally, paid taxes, maintained a small office, and even conducted occasional legitimate consulting work. Mossad had invested considerable resources to make the cover sustainable over extended period. The office where David Arbal worked was meticulously staged. Maritime charts covered the wall, Suez Canal approaches, Mediterranean shipping lanes, port facilities across North Africa and southern Europe. The desk held shipping schedules, Lloyd's Registry of Ships, trade publications, but hidden among the legitimate materials were carefully placed items that would signal to any intelligence operative doing surveillance that this office might contain valuable information. A folder labeled Israeli Naval Procurement left partially visible, documents with Hebrew text that appeared to be military logistics reports. Nothing too obvious. Professional intelligence officers would be suspicious of information left too conveniently in view, but enough to suggest that David Arbal maintained contacts with Israeli defense establishment. Then came the waiting. Mossad couldn't directly approach Iraqi intelligence. That would destroy the illusion. The dangle had to be discovered naturally. Iraqi intelligence had to believe they had found this potentially valuable source through their own initiative. So, Mossad created situations where David Arbal would come to Iraqi attention through seemingly organic means. He frequented restaurants and bars near Iraqi embassy. He attended shipping industry conferences where Iraqi commercial attaches, some of whom were intelligence officers under diplomatic cover, were present. He made himself visible without being obvious. The breakthrough came through a carefully orchestrated introduction in March 1979. At a maritime industry reception, David Arbal was introduced to a man named Hassan al-Tikriti, officially a commercial attaché at the Iraqi embassy, actually an officer in Iraqi Mukhabarat, the intelligence service. The introduction was arranged through a Belgian businessman who had been subtly manipulated by Mossad into thinking he was facilitating a legitimate business connection. Al-Tikriti and Arbal had a brief, professional conversation about Mediterranean shipping routes. Nothing sensitive was discussed, but the seed was planted. Over the following weeks, Al-Tikriti and Arbal encountered each other at several industry events. These meetings appeared coincidental but were carefully staged by Mossad. Each time, their conversations became slightly more personal. Arbal mentioned his Israeli background casually, not hiding it but not emphasizing it either. He mentioned his naval service in passing. He complained about financial pressures. Consulting business was competitive. Margins were thin. He was considering returning to Israel, but had complicated personal reasons for staying in Europe. All of this was building a profile that Iraqi intelligence would find compelling. By May 1979, Al-Takriti had clearly reported David Arbal to his superiors as a potential recruitment target. Iraqi intelligence would have conducted background checks verifying his business registration, checking his apartment, possibly conducting surveillance. Everything they found would have confirmed his cover story. The business was real. The apartment showed signs of genuine occupancy. His lifestyle matched his claimed income. There were no obvious red flags. Iraqi intelligence began the slow process of assessing whether David Arbal could be recruited. The recruitment approach came in July 1979, but indirectly. Al-Takriti invited Arbal to dinner at an expensive Brussels restaurant beyond what a commercial attach would normally spend on a casual business contact. During dinner, conversation turned to politics. Al-Takriti expressed sympathy for Arbal's frustration with Israeli policies. He suggested that people of conscience sometimes had to make difficult decisions about where their loyalties lay. He mentioned casually that Iraq was interested in developing better understanding of regional maritime security issues and would value insights from someone with Arbal's background. Nothing explicit was said. No direct request for classified information. Just an opening, testing whether Arbal would be receptive. David Arbal, the Mossad officer playing him, responded exactly as a genuine potential recruit would, with cautious interest mixed with nervousness. He didn't immediately agree to anything. He expressed concern about the sensitivity of what was being suggested. But he also didn't shut the conversation down. He left the door open. Over subsequent weeks, Al-Takriti gradually increased pressure, offering first friendship, then financial assistance with Arbal's business difficulties, then finally explicit requests for specific information about Israeli naval activities. The recruitment followed textbook intelligence methodology, which meant Iraqi handlers believed they were in control of the process. By September 1979, David Arbal had been fully recruited as an Iraqi intelligence asset. He began providing documents to Al-Takriti information about Israeli naval deployments, weapons procurement, port security measures. The information was carefully crafted by Mossad. Some of it was accurate but harmless details that Iraqi intelligence could verify through other sources, building Arbal's credibility. Some of it was subtly misleading, exaggerating certain Israeli capabilities while downplaying others, designed to influence Iraqi strategic assessments in directions favorable to Israel. All of it was controlled, ensuring that nothing genuinely damaging reached Iraqi hands while maintaining Arbal's perceived value as a source. The payments started small, a few $1,000s for initial documents. As the information's perceived value increased, so did the payments. Iraqi intelligence was investing in their asset, believing they had successfully recruited an Israeli with access to military secrets. From Mossad's perspective, the money was irrelevant. What mattered was what the payments revealed. The funds came through specific bank accounts that could be traced. The couriers who delivered payments could be identified and followed. The methods Iraqi intelligence used to communicate with their asset revealed their operational security procedures. Every interaction provided intelligence about how Iraqi services operated. But the real value of Operation Wooden Leg wasn't the disinformation Mossad was feeding to Iraq. It was the intelligence Mossad was gathering about Iraqi intelligence networks in Europe. Through David Arbal, Mossad identified at least 6 Iraqi intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in Brussels, Paris, and Geneva. They mapped the command structure, understanding who reported to whom. They identified methods Iraqi intelligence used to communicate with Baghdad, including specific courier routes and communication protocols. They learned what intelligence priorities Iraqi handlers considered most important, revealing Iraq's strategic concerns and military planning. Most valuably, through David Arbal, Mossad was able to identify other sources Iraqi intelligence had recruited. Al-Takriti, believing he had established trusting relationship with Arbal, occasionally mentioned other Iraqi operations in Europe, not with specific details, but with enough information that Mossad could identify patterns. A comment about another source in the shipping industry led to identification of a Greek businessman actually providing information to Iraq. A reference to technical intelligence from Germany helped narrow down a potential leak in European defense contractor. David Arbal became a window into Iraqi intelligence operations across Europe. The operation required extraordinary patience and discipline. The Mossad officer playing David Arbal lived his cover identity for nearly 2 years. He couldn't break character, couldn't have normal relationships, couldn't live a normal life. Every interaction was part of the operation. He met with Iraqi handlers dozens of times, maintaining the careful balance of seeming valuable enough to keep, but not so important that Iraqi intelligence would scrutinize him too carefully. He lived in constant awareness that one detail that didn't match his cover story, one moment where he revealed training or knowledge that David Arbal shouldn't possess, would expose the operation and potentially get him killed. The psychological toll was immense. Living a false identity for extended periods creates cognitive dissonance that can be mentally destabilizing. Intelligence services prepare operatives for this, but preparation only goes so far. The officer playing David Arbal later described feeling like he was losing touch with his real identity, that the character he was playing was taking over. He had to maintain regular contact with his Mossad handlers' meetings, disguised as legitimate business trips to undergo psychological evaluations, ensuring he remained mentally stable. Several times, Mossad considered extracting him because the stress was becoming unsustainable. The operation expanded in 1980 when Iraqi intelligence asked David Arbal to help recruit additional sources. They wanted him to use his business contacts to identify other Israelis or Europeans who might have access to information Iraq wanted. This was standard practice once an intelligence service has one successful asset. They leverage that asset to recruit others. For Mossad, this was opportunity to deepen the deception. They created additional fake identities business associates of David Arbal who also appeared to have access to sensitive information. These secondary characters were played by other Mossad operatives, creating an entire network of fake sources feeding controlled information to Iraqi intelligence. The operation's scope eventually included 5 separate fake identities, all connected to David Arbal. Had their own cover stories, their own specializations, their own motivations for cooperation. Iraqi intelligence believed they had developed a significant network providing comprehensive intelligence about Israeli military capabilities. In reality, they were receiving carefully orchestrated disinformation while Mossad mapped their entire European operation. The resources required to maintain this deception were enormous: multiple operatives on long-term deployment, extensive administrative support to maintain cover identities, careful coordination to ensure different strands of the deception remained consistent. By 1981, Mossad had gathered enough intelligence about Iraqi operations in Europe that they could have rolled up the entire network, arresting Iraqi officers, expelling diplomats, dismantling infrastructure. But they chose not to. As long as Iraqi intelligence believed their sources were legitimate, they would continue operating in ways Mossad could observe. The intelligence value of watching them operate exceeded the value of shutting them down. It was more useful to know what Iraqi intelligence was doing than to stop them from doing it, as long as Mossad controlled what information they received. The operation might have continued indefinitely, but events outside Mossad's control forced its conclusion. In June 1981, Israel launched Operation Opera, the airstrike that destroyed Iraq's Asyric nuclear reactor near Baghdad. The attack was based partly on intelligence gathered through other operations, but its success demonstrated Israeli military capabilities that contradicted some of the disinformation David Arbal had been feeding Iraqi intelligence. Specifically, Arbal had provided assessments suggesting Israeli Air Force couldn't conduct long-range precision strikes deep into Iraqi territory. The Asyric raid proved that assessment completely wrong. Iraqi intelligence immediately launched internal investigation to determine why their intelligence about Israeli capabilities had been so inaccurate. David Arbal came under suspicion. Had he been deliberately feeding them false information? Was he a double agent? Iraqi handlers demanded explanations. Arbal, following Mossad protocols, expressed his own surprise at Israeli capabilities, suggested his sources had underestimated their own military's abilities, offered to provide updated assessments, but the trust was broken. Iraqi intelligence became cautious, reducing their contact with Arbal, conducting more thorough counterintelligence checks. Mossad assessed that the operation's useful life was ending. The risk that Iraqi intelligence would eventually uncover the deception was increasing. In September 1981, they began planning extraction. David Arbal told his Iraqi handlers that he was traveling to Israel to visit family and resolve business matters. In reality, the Mossad officer playing him was being pulled out of deep cover. The David Arbal identity was gradually dissolved, the Brussels apartment was vacated. The business was closed, the phone number disconnected. By December 1981, David Arbal had disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. Iraqi intelligence likely realized eventually that they had been deceived, but they couldn't be certain. Had David Arbal been a Mossad plant from the beginning, or had he been a legitimate source who became unreliable? The uncertainty was itself valuable to Mossad. It made Iraqi intelligence question all their sources, wonder which other agents might be feeding them disinformation, doubt their own assessment capabilities. Paranoia is a weapon in intelligence warfare. Destroying an enemy's confidence in their sources is almost as valuable as destroying the sources themselves. The intelligence gained from Operation Wooden Leg was used extensively throughout the 1980s. The information about Iraqi intelligence methods helped Mossad identify and counter Iraqi operations in other countries. The understanding of Iraqi strategic priorities informed Israeli military planning. The identification of Iraqi intelligence officers led to several being quietly expelled from European countries or placed under surveillance that limited their effectiveness. Some of the secondary sources Mossad had created as part of the operation were left in place after David Arbal disappeared, continuing to feed disinformation to Iraqi intelligence for years afterward. The officer who played David Arbal spent months in psychological rehabilitation after extraction. Living another identity for nearly 3 years had created identity confusion that required professional treatment. He was eventually reassigned to desk positions within Mossad rather than returning to field operations. Other operatives who had played supporting roles in the operation returned to regular assignments, but all were required to undergo psychological evaluation to ensure they hadn't been compromised by the extended deception operation. The operation remained classified for decades. Unlike kinetic operations like the Entebbe raid or Asirak bombing, which became public knowledge immediately, dangle operations like Wooden Leg can only be revealed long after they occur, when exposure no longer compromises methods or sources. Some details remain classified even today. The real name of the officer who played David Arbal has never been revealed. The identities of Iraqi intelligence officers who were identified through the operation remain protected to avoid revealing sources. The specific disinformation that was fed through the operation remains classified because similar methodologies might be used in future operations. What has been acknowledged, though never officially, is that Mossad conducted extensive dangle operations against multiple Arab intelligence services throughout the 1970s and 1980s. David Arbal was probably not the only fake identity created to lure enemy intelligence into revealing themselves, the methodology creating elaborate cover identities. Maintaining them for years, using them to map enemy intelligence networks became standard practice. It required enormous resources and patience, but the intelligence return justified the investment. The psychological warfare aspect of operations like Wooden Leg is often overlooked. Even after the operation ended, Iraqi intelligence would have spent years wondering how many of their other sources were genuine. Every piece of intelligence they received would be questioned. Every source would be suspected of being a potential plant. The operational paralysis caused by this uncertainty was almost as valuable as the direct intelligence gathering. An intelligence service that can't trust its sources is effectively blind, forced to second-guess every assessment, unable to provide confident analysis to political leadership. The operation also demonstrated a fundamental principle of counterintelligence. Sometimes the most effective action is inaction. Mossad didn't actively hunt Iraqi intelligence officers in Europe. They didn't conduct aggressive operations to disrupt Iraqi activities. They simply created an attractive target, made it visible, and waited. The enemy did the work of revealing themselves by attempting to exploit what they believed was an opportunity. The patience required for this approach is extraordinary, maintaining elaborate deception for years while waiting for enemy to take action, but the results validated the methodology. For Iraqi intelligence, the experience was humbling. They had believed they were successfully penetrating Israeli networks, obtaining valuable intelligence, building sustainable sources. In reality, they were being manipulated, fed disinformation, and having their own networks mapped by the very target they believed they were spying on. The revelation, however it came, would have triggered wholesale review of their European operations, questioning every source, every piece of intelligence, every assessment. The damage to organizational confidence was probably more significant than any specific operational compromise. The broader question Operation Wooden Leg raises is about the nature of truth in intelligence work. David Arbal was a fiction, but he was a fiction maintained with such detail and consistency that he became functionally real. He had bank accounts, business relationships, a residential address, an employment history. In every measurable way, David Arbal existed. Only his identity, the connection between that existence and any actual human being, was false. This raises philosophical questions about identity and reality that intelligence services rarely contemplate, but that affect operatives profoundly. The operation also illuminated the vulnerabilities created by intelligence desperation. Iraqi intelligence needed information about Israeli capabilities. That need made them susceptible to manipulation. They wanted David Arbal to be what he appeared to be, a valuable source providing rare access, so they rationalized away doubts and overlooked warning signs. Intelligence services are supposed to be skeptical, to assume deception, to verify rigorously before trusting. But the pressure to produce results, to provide political leadership with intelligence they demand, can override caution. Mossad exploited that pressure perfectly. For Israel, operations like Wooden Leg represented asymmetric warfare conducted through intelligence rather than military force. Israel couldn't match Arab states in population, territory, or natural resources. But it could build intelligence services sophisticated enough to map enemy operations, control information flows, and create illusions so convincing that enemies destroyed themselves trying to exploit non-existent opportunities. The return on investment was extraordinary, relatively modest resources dedicated to creating and maintaining. David Arbal's false identity yielded years of intelligence about Iraqi operations. The operation's legacy within Mossad is significant. It became case study taught to new operatives, demonstrating the value of patience, attention to detail, and commitment to maintaining cover identities even when operations become psychologically difficult. It validated methodologies that Mossad would use in subsequent operations, and it established, reputation deserved or not, that Mossad could create illusions so perfect that even sophisticated intelligence services couldn't detect them. That reputation itself became weapon, making enemies paranoid, forcing them to question their sources, creating operational paralysis through uncertainty. The human cost of operations like Wooden Leg is rarely discussed. The officer who played David Arbal sacrificed nearly 3 years of his life, living a false identity, unable to maintain normal relationships, constantly at risk of exposure. Other operatives involved in the operation made similar sacrifices. These costs are justified within intelligence services as necessary for national security, but they're real nonetheless. The operatives who conduct these missions live with psychological impacts long after operations end. Some never fully recover their sense of authentic identity after years of pretending to be someone else. If this investigation into how Mossad created an entire false identity, maintained it for years, and used it to map enemy intelligence networks by doing nothing except waiting for the enemy to reveal themselves, fascinated you, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe because we're continuing to expose the most sophisticated intelligence operations in history. And activate notifications. The next classified deception operation is ready to be revealed.